Okay, welcome back to this final part of the lecture on short-term voting factors, focusing this time on the election campaign. So, what is a campaign, an election campaign? It's basically anything parties do to appeal directly to voters in the run-up to an election, from participating in debates and holding rallies, to producing and distributing leaflets, knocking on doors, producing posters and billboards, any kind of advertising and anything else directed at winning votes from the public. The official campaigning period for UK general elections lasts for 5 weeks, from the date of the dissolution of Parliament to the date of the election itself 5 weeks later. During this period, campaign spending is strictly limited. The maximum any party can spend on their campaign is $30,000 for each constituency in which they stand a candidate. So if a party stands in every single one of the 650 seats in the House of Commons, the 650 constituencies, their spending would be capped at £19.5 million. Of course, we know. Pause the video. Why do no parties stand? Why is no party stand in all 650 seats? Pause the video. A little bit of synoptic links for you. Did you get it? Because the major UK parties don't stand in Northern Ireland. But obviously, Lib Dems, Labour, Conservatives stand in most of the 650 seats in the UK. All of them basically, except for Northern Ireland. There are also strict impartiality rules on the BBC during the campaign period, requiring equal time to be given to the governing party and the official opposition party. Corbyn attributed his party's success in the 2017 election precisely to these rules, which ensured that he and his party got a fair hearing. The fact that there is such volatility in elections now, compared to the past, means that campaigns are now more important than ever, with more swing voters up for grabs, as it were. In 2019, over a quarter of voters only made up their mind who to vote for in the month before the election, with 16% only deciding on polling day itself. This obviously gives the campaign added importance, as parties desperately seek to persuade those undecided voters to choose them. Widespread voter disengagement also gives the campaign added importance. A Hansard Society study in 2019 found that 30% of the British public never talk about politics. With so little thought given to politics, this potentially makes the public much more susceptible to short, simple messages expressed through political campaigns. Spencer Livermore, Tony Blair's strategic advisor, argued that campaign strategy is more important than the party leader, suggesting that a bad leader can win with a good campaign strategy, whereas a good leader can't win with a bad campaign strategy. The difference that the campaign can make was highlighted during the 2017 election, during which the popularity ratings of Jeremy Corbyn increased massively. Focus groups run by Lord Ashcroft found that again and again, voters who were initially sceptical of Corbyn were won over by his performance during the campaign period. A staggering 57% of Labour voters in the 2017 election only made up their mind to vote Labour during the final month before the election, suggesting that Labour's campaign had had a huge influence on attracting its voters. According to Livermore, the 3 most important elements of a good campaign are: number 1, understanding the concerns of the electorate, especially by using extensive polling and focus groups. 2, understanding your opponent's narrative and effectively countering their narrative about you. And 3, developing a clear narrative of your own that connects the past and the present with a desirable future. Looking at the 2019 election again, it's clear that the Conservatives did all 3 of these masterfully. Let's look at each one in turn as it applies to 2019. Firstly, the Conservatives put a huge amount of energy into understanding the concerns of the electorate, spending an incredible $5 million of their campaigning budget on market research and canvassing alone. Dominic Cummings, the mastermind behind the Vote Leave operation in 2016, had argued that the Brexit victory was a result of, quote, listening very hard to people and then targeting their campaign very specifically to people's concerns. So when he was recruited by Johnson to his election campaign team in 2019, Cummings organised extensive polling, especially in the Red Wall seats, traditional Labour strongholds in the North and Midlands that the Conservatives were targeting. This polling led directly to the Conservatives' campaign focus on Brexit, crime and the NHS, key concerns of the Red Wall voters. Indeed, the Conservatives' key election slogan, "Get Brexit Done," was a phrase that actually emerged from voters themselves in these focus groups. Secondly, as we've already mentioned, the Conservatives learnt well the lessons of 2017 when they'd not been able to effectively counter Labour's narrative of the Conservatives as uncaring and cruel. So this is Livermore's second ingredient of a good campaign, right? Understanding your opponent's narrative, and especially your opponent's narrative about you, and countering that. A key Conservative weak point has always been their disdain for public services, and in particular the idea that only a Labour government will protect the NHS. Labour made this a central plank of their campaign, suggesting that the Conservatives would open up the NHS to takeover by private US corporations. But this time the Conservatives were ready and made the employment of 50,000 extra nurses and building 40 new hospitals a key plank of their campaign. It turned out that both these claims were extremely dubious, but they were nevertheless effective at countering the Labour narrative that the NHS was not safe in Tory hands, to such an extent that by the end of the campaign, more voters trusted the Tories with the NHS than they trusted Labour, an incredible turnaround in Labour's historical reputation as the party of the NHS. Thirdly, the Conservatives were much more effective at developing a clear narrative of their own that connected with voters and told a compelling story linking the past, the present and the imagined future of the country. The slogan, "Get Brexit Done," actually did all of this in 3 simple words. It suggested that Brexit had been the democratic decision of the nation, but that it was at present being blocked by the Labour opposition in a hung parliament, and that in the future Boris Johnson would get it done so that the country could move forward to a more positive future and heal the divisions caused by Brexit. Just 3 simple words encapsulating this entire narrative. This narrative was then reinforced through a slew of advertisements on social media in particular, seen, for example, by every single person who logged onto YouTube on the weekend before the election. The phrase was then hammered home again and again by Boris Johnson and every other Conservative candidate in every interview they conducted. This is known as message discipline, and it was a very effective way of ensuring the key message gets across to that section of the electorate who do not pay much attention to politics. As Tony Blair once said, just when you're fed up to the back teeth of hearing a message, that's the very moment when voters are just starting to hear it. Again, Cummings played a particular role in the construction. I'll just say, going to go into some more depth now about 2019. So note-taking optional, but listen because it's interesting. So again, Cummings played a particular role in the construction of this Brexit narrative, which began to be constructed long before the campaign officially begun. In the 6 months before the election, from the moment Johnson took over from Theresa May in the summer of 2019 at the head of the Conservative minority government, acting on Cummings' advice, Johnson had made Cummings his senior advisor at this point, Johnson repeatedly put Brexit plans before Parliament that he knew would be blocked. Traditional political wisdom suggests that such a string of government defeats would be humiliating and disempowering for a Prime Minister. But what Cummings and Johnson were doing was helping to plant a narrative of, quote, the people versus Parliament in the public imagination. Here was Johnson valiantly attempting to follow through the people's will, but being frustrated at every step by the Labour opposition in the hung Parliament. Thus, when the election campaign officially began, the public had already been primed to this narrative of a heroic Johnson fighting the forces attempting to frustrate the people's will. The fact that it was Johnson himself who had led the parliamentary opposition to Theresa May's attempts to get Brexit done was quietly forgotten. The focus on Brexit was a very strategic move in the Conservative campaign in several other ways as well. Firstly, it was a very effective way of leveraging the voting system to the Conservatives' advantage. Although overall only 52% of the population had voted Brexit in 2016, 60% of seats had an overall Leave majority. By effectively presenting the election as a rerun of the referendum, Johnson was able to replicate this maximisation of the return of seats for votes. Just as Remain voters were concentrated in dense urban areas and Leave voters were spread out across smaller towns, so too was the Labour 2019 vote concentrated in urban strongholds, where Labour tended to win big, winning seats with large majorities, whilst the Conservatives won by very small margins in over a dozen seats. This meant that many Labour votes were wasted, while Conservative votes were much more effectively distributed to ensure maximum seats. Secondly, the Brexit focus worked to the Conservatives' advantage by splitting the Labour vote. The Remain supporting parties actually received a substantial majority of votes in the 2019 election, if we include Labour in that category. But that Remain vote was split between Labour, the Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru and the SNP. The Leave vote, on the other hand, was effectively united behind the Conservatives, aided by the Brexit Party's decision not to stand candidates in Tory-held seats. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that by standing candidates in Labour-held Red Wall seats, the Brexit Party actually helped Conservative victories in many of those seats as well. This is because they were able to take enough votes away from Labour, from voters who would never have contemplated voting Tory, to allow the Tories to win. Third, the Conservatives' campaign focus on Brexit allowed them to mobilise a section of the electorate who did not normally vote. The Brexit vote achieved a 72% turnout at a time when election turnouts had not been that high for decades. By presenting the election as a rerun of the referendum, Johnson's team were able to persuade those who do not normally bother to vote in elections, but who did vote in the referendum, that this was their last chance to make sure their Brexit dream will become a reality. Incredibly, the 2019 electorate included over 2 million people who had voted Leave in 2016 but had not voted in the 2017 general election, accounting for 2/3 of the Conservatives' increase in vote share. And finally, the Brexit focus allowed the incumbent government, who had been in power for almost a decade, to present itself as the party of change. Again, an incredible achievement. Chris Powell, who worked on Labour's 1997 election campaign, said there are really only two basic campaign slogans: steady as we go, or time for a change. The Conservative focus on Brexit allowed the Conservatives to present themselves as the party of radical change, leaving the EU, and Labour as the party of more of the same, a hung parliament wrangling over Brexit, and perhaps even overturning the referendum result altogether. A few other aspects of the Conservatives' campaign's strategy are also worth discussing. Firstly, its use of social media. This is 2019 we're talking about still. Labour is thought to have won the social media battle in 2017 with much more effective use of platforms like Facebook to get the message across. In 2019, however, the Conservatives ploughed an estimated £500,000 on running a series of ads in the final week of the campaign on YouTube, the biggest ever election spending ever seen on that particular platform. Across a 3-day period, just days before the election, anyone who watched anything on YouTube in the UK was subjected to a Tory election broadcast, which reached millions of people in just a few hours. These videos were slick and well made, especially in contrast to the rather amateurish Labour videos. And this is largely a result of the second aspect I want to highlight: finance. The Conservatives raked in a massive 19 million in donations to their campaign from wealthy donors, compared to just 5 million received by Labour. This allows the Conservatives to produce far better resources, send out far more adverts, employ far more high-level advertising consultancies, etc., and made a huge difference to what they were able to achieve. And some of these consultancies used some very underhand tactics. So the third and final aspect of the Conservative campaign that must be mentioned is their use of what might be termed dirty tricks. For example, the Tories paid £500,000 to an advertising consultancy called Topham Guerin, whose job was to undermine the Labour campaign. Their work included, for example, renaming the Conservatives' Twitter account Fact Check UK during the televised debates so that they could undermine Corbyn's points and support Johnson's with a veneer of objectivity. They also set up a fake website posing as Labour's manifesto but full of comments undermining Labour's positions. They then paid Google to ensure that this website came up top of any web searches entered for Labour manifesto, above the actual Labour manifesto itself. Another dirty trick used by the Conservatives was straight up lying in their adverts. One study found that 88% of Conservative adverts contained claims that were either not correct or not entirely correct, compared to just 7% of adverts from the Labour Party. These false Conservative claims included massively exaggerated estimates of the cost of Labour's spending plans, and falsehoods about the numbers of new hospitals the Conservatives would build. In conclusion, I would argue that given the rise in swing voting and partisan de-alignment in recent decades, short-term factors are now more important than long-term factors in influencing voting behaviour, and certainly more important in influencing election outcomes. Whilst there are still strong connections between Labour and young voters and ethnic minority voters, the fact is that most voters are white and old or middle-aged. And a majority of these voters are now swing voters, changing the vote from one election to the next based on recency factors such as party leaders, media coverage, policies and the election campaign itself. Of all these factors, I believe it's media coverage and the election campaign which have the most direct impact on voting behaviour. This is because it's through these two channels that people receive the political information on which they'll base their voting decision. Yet nevertheless, I believe that party policies are in fact the most important factor. That is because it's the party's policies which ultimately determine both the strength of their campaign and their media coverage. If a party has policies which serve the interests of Britain's 170 billionaires, those billionaires will give them lavish campaign funding and will use the newspapers they control to provide a stream of free and constant propaganda on behalf of that party. But if a party has policies which oppose the interests of those 170 people, that party will be starved of funds, resulting in a diminished and amateur campaign, as well as a massive campaign of media demonisation against them, as Corbyn learned only too well. Okay, thanks for listening to these lectures on short-term factors. I should just reference most of the information I got on the 2017 and 2019 elections came from 2 books that I would definitely recommend, really interesting books. One by Steve Rayson called The Fall of the Red Wall. One by Deborah Mattinson called Beyond the Red Wall. Both really interesting studies of what happened in those Red Wall seats to give the Conservatives their landslide victory in 2019. Should also reference Lord Ashcroft's book, The Lost Majority, which is the sort of summary of his focus groups looking at the 2017 election. And I suppose I should also reference a zigzag education lecture on models of media that I covered in the media video. So yeah, you can't get that because it's behind a £400 paywall, which I think is disgusting, but I suppose everyone's got to earn a crust or whatever. Anyway, I'm against that. My stuff's free, and so I've got no shame in sharing with you the stuff that's supposed to be reserved for the schools that can afford it. All right, yeah, so cheers, Zigzag. Okay, thank you.